I was asked by the organizers in terms of doing introductions to do a little more framing than introducing. We all have Google, and there are lots of interesting stories to be found on Google and factoids about our speaker. But I thought, I'll take 2 minutes at the opening just to talk about a transatlantic Christian council from this side of the Atlantic, but not the United States of America. Because there is an invisible border at the 49th parallel. And some of the translation that has to happen between different contexts is as significant between countries that are as connected as Canada and the United States. 70% of our trade is with the United States. And yet it was striking to me yesterday afternoon that much of the way things were framed and communicated by some of our American friends, who are our closest friends and allies, simply would fall outside of the norm of discourse in a Canadian setting. You could not say in a Canadian setting some of the things that were said yesterday afternoon and belong to any of the mainstream in Canadian politics. You could take those positions, but the language with which it was communicated is entirely different. It was a stark reminder to me of the challenge that we are going to be discussing today as we talk about what it means to work together. In Canada, we don't have the separation of church and state tradition. In fact, Canada is, to some extent, a peace treaty between French Catholics and English Protestants. We have very embedded into our history and our culture a particular way of having religious dialogue. At the same time, neither do we have the civil religion tradition that you have in the United States, which allows for a language and a candor in the public square. We're officially a multicultural country. In Toronto, Caucasians, while the largest group, are a minority. And so we've had a very different way of navigating. Cardis, we started Cardis in 2000, recognizing the fact that there were some unique challenges in terms of bringing the wisdom and insights of 2,000 years of Christian social thought to the issues of the day. And it's striking as I thought about the proposal that we hope to end up with this afternoon, and I want you to listen with that lens in mind today, also in our conversation. I think there are two challenges we're going to face. On the one hand, we're going to have to get beyond the 30,000-foot theoretical level of conversation, in which I would imagine there would be general agreement in this room, to recognize the fact that we need to, if this is going to be meaningful and long-term on an institutional level of working together, we're going to have to find ways to make it practical and tangible in terms of the day-to-day experiences and work that each of us are engaged in our own country. So how to take the things that we can agree on at a conference internationally and to bring it down to that sort of level, I think will be a real challenge. That said, I think we also have to recognize that in our postmodern, post-Christendom era, our understanding of what 2,000 years of Christian social thought means in our context may be changing. I know that in Canada, I have said for the last number of years, we have to learn how to be Daniel in Babylon, as opposed to some of the other assumptions that have informed most of the tradition of Christian engagement in the public square. We have to learn what it means to speak winsomely in a pagan context and culture where many of the core assumptions and even language that we use cannot be assumed. We also are going to have to deal with the challenge that the identification of Christian social thought in our own countries is often mixed with some idolatry. There's bad mixed with the good. And a new lens also we have to be open to be challenged internally in terms of how we both communicate and live up to the ideals. And that will take integrity and courage. The second challenge that we will have is to understand that in most of our situations, I think, public policy in our own country requires a global perspective. I'm reminded of the fact that the response to 2008 economic crisis required a G20 finance ministers meeting where we all committed together to do certain things in order to overcome things. No longer was the nation state the primary actor. We have this with NAFTA in Europe, you have the European Union. I know in Canada, we're in the process of signing a free trade agreement with the European Union that will change the dynamics again. So from an economic point of view, from a security, yesterday was the 13th anniversary of 9/11, and I don't need to recount to this room what has happened since there in terms of international global security. And I think that speaks to the fact that probably those of us in the Christian think tank world who take seriously our faith commitments and want to apply them, we need each other. We need each other to learn and to help get beyond our own borders in a way that we probably never did before. That's why I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to participate. I'm also privileged to introduce our speakers. They already have been highlighted. I've been a long admirer of Os Guinness. The Williamsburg Charter and his book, The American Hour, was formative in my early years of political engagement. He's the offspring of medical missionaries, has an impressive international journalistic career, and not least importantly among his credentials, he is the great-grandson of the Dublin brewer. Ladies and gentlemen, you can find out much more about him by Googling his name, but rather than list his impressive resume, please join me in giving a welcome to Roger.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you all. It's a real privilege to be here. I said to Todd, I wasn't quite sure why he asked me to speak on this one. Any one of you in this distinguished group could equally do the job. And also, I was asking 2 Europeans. The distinguished senator pointed out that I'm from the Anglo-Saxon part of Europe, not the more southern part, so there are different voices. It's a tremendous privilege. There are times when history and human decision meet at a single point and cast the die of a nation's fortune. It was like that for Rome when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It was like that for England when Sir Francis Drake sailed out to meet the Armada. It was like that for America when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. But equally, as we know, there are times when it's the gathered consequences of a whole generation that stamp the die of a nation's fortunes. And we can see that on this issue. Certainly in this country, where 50 years of American culture warring have brought the issue of religious liberty to a place that the founders would probably be shocked by, and are truly almost reaching the tipping point where America will squander this great heritage of religious freedom. The little I can say that would be new to many of you. So let me just set out some points which I think we need to make in public to argue for the importance of this issue and why. First, we need to have people understand why this issue is globally important. In many academic circles today, this issue is only a security issue, terrorism. Rather than an issue of security, which rises to the ordering of our societies and at its highest involves human flourishing. But why is it an issue? Globally, living with our deepest differences is now an issue that underlies almost all other issues, and it needs settling. We can see on the one hand an extraordinary religious resurgence. When I was an undergraduate, the secularization theory was still dominant, and has since, of course, collapsed. And we can see now a global resurgence of religion, but this time countered by a highly aggressive secularism. And together that means this issue needs to be solved in a new way. And that leads to the second factor. That many of our traditional ways of handling the issue are clearly foundering. As we look across Europe, many of our countries have settlements that have been shaped by some great year in their history. For the French, obviously, 1789 and the Revolution. And you can see the conditions out of which that was created led to laïcité and this strict separation of religion and public life. In England, Our great year was 1688. And for various political reasons, there was still a state church, but not coercive, and since then with no blood on its hands. And while it's still there, over the centuries, it has faded away almost into irrelevance. So the skeptics say that England now, the Church of England is only for the hatching, matching, and dispatching, baptizing, marrying, and burial of citizens, and today is incredibly weak culturally, spiritually, and theologically. Here in the US, the key event was 1791 and the First Amendment. As we all know well, no established church, and now everyone with freedom of conscience on the basis of their conscience able to choose. And three very different situations, but all three foundering under the impact of globalization, of immigration, and of the challenges of living with our deepest differences. And of course the third factor is the emergence of a truly rudimentary but real global public square. All those who come from a European background trace the origins of this to Athens and the Agora. Well, you can see it went from the Agora to the Forum in Rome, to Westminster, Capitol Hill, or wherever. The public square was a physical place. But then it went from a physical place to a metaphor. And wherever the issues of common public life were debated and decided, that too was a public square. But now in the age of the internet, it's gone from the physical to the metaphorical to the virtual. And now we can see the emergence of a truly global public square, where this issue of living with our differences desperately needs to be resolved. And we need to make the argument for why that is such a powerful global issue in our time. Secondly, we need to make the case why religious freedom, why freedom of conscience is so primary and foundational. I've lived here nearly 30 years in this town now, and have heard religious liberty dismissed in many, many ways. Liberty for the religious. Or like the appendix, a part of the Constitution that's really unnecessary compared with free speech. And we can think of the ways today, even under this administration, where religious freedom is being narrowed down to freedom of worship. But we need to make the case in many, many ways why it's primary. Why with the three basic political freedoms, conscience, speech, and assembly, they're interlocking, and any hierarchy would be invidious. But freedom of assembly assumes and requires freedom of speech, and freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. We speak, and we get together with those because of the dictates of conscience by which we're bound. And historically, that understanding of freedom of conscience has always been the respect for the inner forum, which is part of our respect for the external forum, the public square, through which freedom must thrive. And of course today, we also need to make the case why freedom of conscience is so primary and foundational for a civil society. Many people speaking of it today. And yet while many pay lip service to civil society, many forget that civil society flourishes when religious freedom and freedom of conscience are respected, and people are able to found and guide all sorts of voluntary organizations to pursue their dreams and their visions for charity, for reform, or whatever. So there's something like the Obama healthcare mandates, quite literally killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And while they pay lip service to civil society, they're undercutting the central means of its survival. And for me, the third argument is the whole notion of social harmony. I was born in China. I go back to China every year or year and a half. And again I hear the Chinese say when I'm talking about religious freedom, well, of course we have here national harmony, social harmony, Hu Jintao style. I say to them, that's no big deal. You have diversity, and you have social harmony. But you miss the important ingredient, liberty. And the real challenge of the global era is to have diversity with liberty and still achieve national harmony. And that has never been done without a deep understanding of how we grant to everyone religious freedom and freedom for all in ways that are accommodating. Thirdly, though, I think we have to go on to face many of the weaknesses of our Western responses to the current problems. Even many conservatives in this country, or Christian conservatives in this country, have, in my opinion, gone wrong in the way they fought for these issues, and certainly many so-called liberals have also. First, you can see that many people now think that you can establish religious freedom by law alone. I remember nearly 30 years ago when I was involved in the Williamsburg Charter, which Ray mentioned. I was meeting with one of the heads of the ACLU, and he said to me, there's a simple reason why we will always win. We have more lawyers than anyone else. They don't today. Batteries of liberal lawyers with huge liberal defense funds are countered by batteries of conservative lawyers with huge defense funds, and the result is endless litigation. And we're even further from religious freedom for everybody and civility. Now the liberals can be excused for that mistake because it's been part of their philosophy for a long time, but not the conservatives. As the Europeans know well, going back to Montesquieu or Tocqueville, we not only need the structures of freedom, and obviously laws and constitutions are important and essential, but we need the spirit of freedom, or what Tocqueville calls the habits of the heart. And that is more important to freedom even than the law. And to think that we can defend these things only by law and by litigation is an extraordinary mistake. The second mistake that many have made in this country is to seek to defend only our interests rather than the interests of the common good. Thank goodness that's changing. I remember one stage of the Williamsburg Charter, I was given death threats for 6 months by a particular extremist group in the West that was angry at the idea of religious freedom for other people. And you can see today when either deliberately or inadvertently people have only defended their own rights rather than the rights of the common good, religious freedom has been deprived. It's only when everyone's freedom is guaranteed, particularly the freedom of the smallest minority and the most unfashionable community, that everybody's religious freedom is really secure. The third weakness is one that's particularly true of our liberal friends. The idea that we can fight the negative with the negative. A lot was said yesterday, so I won't add to it about hate crimes. But another good example of that is the phobiaization of this issue. The countering of any disagreement, well, you're phobic, Islamophobic, homophobic, and now we're called to play the phobia card and call our enemies Christophobic or Christianophobic. And of course, we as followers of Jesus should be the most broad-shouldered of all people, called to pick up our crosses and follow him and pay the cost of following him if we need to. But to play that victim card is deadly. Because as you can see from the early attempts of the Jews, which was quickly abandoned, those who play themselves as victims come to perceive themselves as victims and eventually paralyze themselves as victims. And of course the phobia card just cuts off debate and one can go no further. Fourthly, though, and this to me is the heart of the discussion, we need to publicly point out the logic of the different models of the public square. We have, I think, two extremes in the world. Visions of a sacred public square, where some religion is either preferred or is established. And of course, there are mild versions. I mentioned the Church of England. It's about as mild as you could get. And some versions are very extreme. currently look at the Islamic State, or Iran, or Saudi Arabia, and we see very powerful, oppressive versions of the sacred public square. And clearly today, where any religion is preferred or established, everyone else is second class and are not granted freedom of conscience. The other extreme is the so-called naked public square, going back to Father Richard John Newhouse. Again, we have mild versions. French laïcité, relatively mild. North Korea, China, and other places, extremely severe. But you can see that in our Western world, with some deliberately, with some inadvertently, our secular elites are pressing for our own version of a naked public square. And clearly, when most of the world is profoundly religious, that is unjust and unfree for those who do not share the secular assumptions. My own proposed solution is a vision of a civil public square. In other words, a vision of public life where everyone of every faith is free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith, but within a political agreement of what is understood to be just and free for everyone else too. In other words, a right for a Christian is a right for a Jew, is a right for an atheist, is a right for a Mormon, or a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or a Hindu, a right for everyone under the sun in that particular country. And that assumes a whole variety of assumptions which go beyond it. The capacity, for example, which was mentioned, the capacity to be winsome and to persuade, so that those who want their views to prevail in democratic public life will need to make arguments for them that are publicly accessible to those who do not share their faith. And there are many other assumptions to that. Now, of course, civility is severely under a cloud today. Many people confuse civility with being nice, rather than seeing it as the classical virtue and duty of citizens in a diverse society who know how to get on with other people of different faiths. Others confuse civility with the lowest common denominator, ecumenism. We all have to give up the distinctives of our own faith in order to get on with others. No, that is a recipe for compromise. And there's no question, at the level of our religious differences, these differences are irreducible and they're ultimate religiously, and those differences make a difference. And a difference not only for individuals, but for entire societies. Take, say, human dignity and other areas where the differences deeply matter. Religious freedom assumes the freedom to be faithful, and yet know how to negotiate those differences with others who are equally free to be faithful to what they believe based on the dictates of conscience. The third common confusion with civility is that it's a form of moral indifference. I put the answer simply like this. The right to believe anything does not mean that anything anyone believes is right. The right to believe anything, a matter of conscience. The right, the sense that anything anyone believes is right, a matter of nonsense. And while we have the right to deeply held convictions, we equally have the right to speak out against those we believe are muddle-headed, or socially disastrous, or even profoundly morally evil. And we need to distinguish freedom of conscience from a moral indifference. What will it take to restore a profound sense that the challenge of living with differences needs freedom of conscience for all and requires a civil public square in which it can be discussing the possibility of renewal in the post-war conditions after World War II. He raised the question, can the Christian church be warmed a third time? He says every Christian would answer yes, but we shouldn't answer too quickly and too easily. Because, as he says, on the outcome of that question and the answer that's given may well depend the the future of humanity. We believe in a profound way that in the heart of the Christian gospel are answers to the future of humanity, dignity, liberty, responsibility, and 100 other issues. So whether we're able to enter the public square freely, and whether we're able to present a case faithfully and persuasively, goes back to whether we solve the issues that we're discussing with our important discussion today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Oz. Certainly nothing muddle-headed about the clarity of that presentation. I will say, as someone who works for an organization called Cardus, which is the Cardo Maximus, the Latin equivalent of Greek agora, I obviously was appreciative of the public square sort of allusions and metaphors, almost thinking that you were subtly, sneaking in a Cardus commercial on our behalf. But I'll slip the check with you. Our second presenter this morning is someone we met yesterday afternoon, a European politician, statesman, and philosopher, Rocco Briccoloni. We had the opportunity to listen to his fascinating presentation on the nature of religious identity and its connection to human rights, and how genuine discourse requires integrity and commitment and living up to promises. Now, I've not had the opportunity to meet Mr. Briccoloni before this conference. That doesn't mean I don't know him. Google search tells you wonderful stories. And there are many, too many to share here. But not least of his credentials is a biography of Pope John Paul II, who Mr. Briccoloni has served as a friend and a counselor. And the book outlines Pope John Paul's significant contribution to the development of Catholic social thought and human rights in our modern context. And I think it reflects not only the subjects, but also the author's expertise in this area. So it's a privilege for us to have you with us today and to share some of that expertise as we think about what a global Christian witness might look for. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rocco